Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of More to It. Before we get started, we need to say that the views, thoughts, analysis, and opinions expressed in this podcast and its author and podcast participants are not the views of Boise State University, the University of Wyoming, the Idaho State Board of Education, or the University of Wyoming Board of Regents. No endorsements of those materials is suggested or implied. Welcome back, everybody. It has been a minute since we were here. My name is Todd Norton.
I'm Jason McConnell. Hi.
And I'm Charlie Powell. Nice to be here.
Charlie, thank you so much. Everybody, I cannot tell you how excited I am about today's discussion. I've known Charlie for, I don't know, maybe about a decade. He was a fantastic mentor as I was moving into crisis and risk communication while I was at Washington State University, and he has a ton of knowledge. Charlie was the senior public information officer at Washington State University's veterinary medical college for 35 years, 34 or 35 years. And he held a concurrent position with the State of Washington Veterinary Medical Association during that same time for 20 years. So Charlie, for the better part of 3 decades, was a pretty busy guy. So thank you so much for joining us today, Charlie.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure entirely.
I appreciate it. One of the first cases I remember us talking about, Charlie, was your management of the bovine. I'm gonna goof up this pronunciation, but you help me out where I need to. Bovine spongiform encephalopathy. How did I do?
You did pretty good. You know, the PH is sounded as an F, but that's okay. You know,
All right, thank you.
That's one of the reasons why media never called it that. Media always called it mad cow disease.
Mad cow disease,
which really made producers very angry.
Yeah.
And, you know, that was a point of contention that we had to work to get them over that. So, yeah, that was, you know, I mean, as you know, because we spoke about it at the time, that was a very, very compelling time for me to be really busy. So here's how it unfolded. On December 23rd, 2003, or 2006, I believe, the first phone call came to my office, and it was about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And it was a reporter at Reuters in Boston who told us we had a case.
Wow.
And I said, well, let me check, because I hadn't heard anything, and I should have heard by that time.
Yep.
So I called the state veterinarian, I called the USDA's area veterinarian in charge. None of them had any knowledge of a carcass being held pending additional testing, which is how the system worked at the time. And so before I could dial this reporter back, I got a call from another person. And he not only told me that we had a case, he told me where it was at and who owned it. And he also said, I'm a trader on the floor of the Chicago Mercantile, and everybody's talking about it here. And within the first hour, the United States lost 17% of the beef market internationally. And there aren't too many businesses that can survive losses like that. But to make a long story short, what bovine spongiform encephalopathy is, or mad cow disease, is it's a protein that becomes misshapen and causes disease. And it's one of the first diseases that we've ever seen like this, okay? So you can think about this as your hand being flat. That's the normal configuration for the protein. And that's how I illustrated it to people. It's in all animals and people, and even in some plants. But for whatever reason in mammals, when it folds on itself, it causes disease. And when it runs into its normal self on the other side, it causes it to form too. So it's self-perpetuating, just like it was replicating if it were a living organism. And so what happens to the animal or the people, the human form of this is called Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. And it also affects goats, it affects mink, it affects many different species. But what happens is these species start to develop these holes in their brain tissue such that the brain looks like a sponge. Okay. And so that is not good, and that's going to prevent an animal from being sold or harvested at all. And so, with that in mind, I knew all I needed to know about this disease long before it struck. I was surprised that the only case, and still to this day, that has been proven to be from a non-origin source in the United States is one cow out of Mabton, Washington. Now, if you know anything about Mabton, Washington, it's in south central Washington state. It's a tiny little wide spot in the road, and there's a lot of dairies around there. This happened to be a dairy cow. And so when I found out where the premises was, I called them. And I called their veterinarian actually. And I told him, I said, look, I'm here to help you in any way possible. Just let me know. And I said, the best thing you can do right now is start making that farm look as good as you can possibly make it. Put out double fresh bedding of straw and everything so you cover as much mud as possible, and make sure the animals are properly cared for, which most times they are. And so he went and did that with the owner. The owner was in absolute shock over all this, of course, because they immediately quarantined his premises, and they immediately put a hold on him eliminating any other animals. And that's a key thing to talk about right now, is if we had this same case today, what I told you about how I found out about it would run way ahead of a phone call on social media. And one of the things when I was teaching that I explained to students was, why does this happen? Why do leaks happen? But you can imagine if you're a secretary and you're sitting there flipping over pages every day that say negative, 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 and then boom, positive. Okay, all of a sudden now that person, and I'm not saying they were the ones that leaked it, that person has information that virtually no one else in the United States knows. And that gives them what I call social media currency. And you can spell that with a C or a T. It doesn't make any difference. Okay. But they will then tell their husband or their significant other. And that person then puts it on Facebook to his 72 friends, and it takes off like wildfire, as you guys all know. So it would be very different today with regard to that. And I think the tactics would be different to deal with it. So what I did for 3 days, I literally lived in my office for 3 days answering phone calls. The first 24 hours, I had over 300 phone calls. And for people that have to manage crisis information, the biggest tip that I can give you is, by all means, prioritize these calls. If it's a freelancer that's calling, as much as I've freelanced and as much as I admire freelancing, if it's a freelancer that's calling, by all means, they go to the bottom of the list versus the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or things of that nature. And for those of you that don't know, those were old ways we used to communicate heavily. But that's an important point. And then this went on there for a long time until within 6 weeks, Washington State University's Washington Animal Disease Diagnostic Laboratory had collected all the pertinent equipment and began testing for mad cow disease. And typically this testing, again, it happens very quickly within a day. If the specimens get there by 10 a.m., they turn them around, and most times they're negative, except for this one animal, which was not tested at WSU. It was tested at a USDA lab. And so that then caused people to pause and think. And this was the other big impact, was, what will consumers think during this holiday season when people ask them if they're serving beef? Because, one of the great alternatives to turkey and ham is a big roast. And so Mapton, Washington was far enough away, and it was so late in the afternoon that television news stations couldn't get there and do a stand-up in front of everything on time. So I knew I had a little bit of time, but I also knew that while nature abhors a vacuum and will fill it with something, so do niches in biology and sociology. What I mean by that is if you have a big box and you put basketballs in it, there's room to put tennis balls between the basketballs. And then you go down to golf balls, and then you go down to ping pong balls. They'll all fit in that box. And so it's going to come out somewhere. It's going to make a difference somewhere. So Seattle media, the first night, they sent a person down to a custom meat market. And as a woman was walking out the door with her child in the cart, sitting in the cart, the reporter rushed up to her and said, knowing that mad cow disease is now in Washington state, are you going to feed beef to your family this Christmas? And she was like dumbfounded. She was totally like a deer in the headlights, and she mumbled and stumbled. And interestingly, that question was the first question asked of the governor at the time. And he stumbled and fumbled, and you wouldn't answer whether they were going to serve beef at the mansion during the holiday season. What they did in Spokane is they sent a reporter and stuff over, and they went to the emergency room and said, "Hey, what do you guys know about mad cow disease?" And they went, "Nothing." And they said, "Well, it's a foodborne illness. It can affect people." And they said, "Well, go talk to our nutritionist." So they went and found the dietitian for the hospital who knew nothing about this. And to his credit, he said so basically on camera. He says, "I don't know. We'll see what the challenges are that come up with this." So one of the interesting things about this disease is it has remained at about the level of 1 in a million animals or 1 in a million people. And that suggests, it doesn't prove, but that suggests there has to be a genetic vulnerability somewhere.
Mm.
And otherwise, it would take off at a much greater rate. So that's where we are. Today, it would be a multi hands on deck managing this. And it would be very different. And the market impacts would be so significant that I suspect the cattle industry would have to reorganize itself.
And I appreciate that, Charlie. It's fantastic. I mean, great overview, and really appreciate that. I'd like to lean in a little bit to understand some of the public information aspects and specifically practices, right? And I hear what you're saying about it would be a totally different game, right? And I'm trying to imagine all of the ways, and of course we don't have to do all of the ways, but it would certainly change public information, right? I'm wondering if you could lean in and talk a little bit about what you would imagine that might look like if we had that case today, right? Or something similar.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I think news like that would spread like wildfire on social media. So that begs the question of us, where do we go first? And as you probably do yourself, and as I'm sure the research supports, people go to Facebook first now, and they look and see what their peers are saying. Because in sales, the number one most powerful sales technique is peer to peer. So, for example, if I need snow tires and I ask my friend Bob, where did he get snow tires? And he says, well, I got them at Costco. Chances are 9 out of 10, I'm going to Costco. Okay. Because we trust that information. So if you look online, you'll probably find it flashing through out there. The other thing you'd have to be careful of is people who are getting photographs of something like this from public property. They can stand there and photograph all they want to, and it's not affecting anything so long as they don't block the driveway or something. So there would be photo support with this. Photo support actually caused a bit of a hairball with this whole thing, in that some of the first news accounts, the cutaways that they would show were of beef cattle, not dairy cattle. Now, dairymen and beef ranchers don't get along well, even though they produce the same species. Okay. And so they were demanding that the networks change and that the networks would offer apologies and corrections and that stuff. That never happened. And it was not something that I spent a lot of time on at all. What I did find amazing is I was asked by a reporter, and I believe it was the New York Times, maybe the New York Post. They said, now, I have found out something very interesting about this disease. And I said, oh, I said, what is that? He said, this occurred in a dairy animal, right? I said, yeah. He said, so what's a dairy animal going into the slaughter system for? He said, I thought they just produce milk. And I said, well, they do just produce milk, but when they're done, they go into the whole slaughter mechanism, and most of them are ground into hamburger. And he went, really? And I said, yeah. I said, 50% of the hamburger you eat is from dairy animals. And he said, why in the world is that? And I said, because half of the population in dairy animals doesn't produce milk. They're called males. And they end up just feeding them out in feedlots and going ahead and slaughtering them. So there was a lot of that basic education that had to happen too. And I just did that in a calm and courteous way with people. Sometimes I would pick an anecdote like I just told you about and work with it a bit. It depended on the person. I did not run into anyone who was hostile about this or trying to do the gotcha moment, if you will, like is so prevalent today.
Thanks. Thank you, Charlie.
Yep.
Jason, you connect that to political sort of aspects?
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
So Charlie, something Todd and I talk about a lot is
Uh-huh.
The increasing politicization of things in daily life. Um, so we've certainly seen over the last 15, maybe 20 years, a significant politicization of public institutions.
Absolutely.
And for that matter, public information.
Yep.
So how do you think that trend impacts the job of a public information officer?
Well, I think it impacts it in a couple of ways. And you have to understand a bit, I think, about how administration has changed. Administration, when they sit down and they start working with budgets, and certainly public universities are being budget strangled in many cases, they start looking at what it's going to cost to be proactive dealing with potential hazards or whatever it may be. And they first eliminate that off the budget because we don't have to do that because that's not here yet. We'll deal with that when it comes. Well, this always refers me back to I've been to bomb school twice, once with the FBI and once with ATF. And in a bombing, they always talk about it in a linear fashion. In the middle of this line is boom, okay? To the left of the line is before boom, and to the right of the line is after boom. You always want to work left of boom, whether it's a bomb or whether it's public relations or information or any of that, okay? Everything you do during boom and after costs more money than imaginable, time, resources, and it can damage markets very, very quickly. And so that's where our premium comes in. We're able to do that proactive type of communication if we're allowed to do it. I think now public information officers at the basic college level are not going to be able to do some of the things that I was able to do to speak for the college and speak for the veterinary profession in the state of Washington. And certainly I did that with everybody's approval, but we got approval quickly. And the reason you get approval quickly is because you've developed relationships ahead of time. Okay. That's one thing that I would tell everyone now is if you've got people in a legal department saying, don't talk, don't say this, don't do that, develop a better relationship with them now, because the reason they're telling you that is because if you remain silent, that's the only way they can be assured that they have complete control over the case. And it's not control anymore. It is management of these things, and you can manage better together than you can apart. And so sow those seeds of trust long before you need to cash them in.
Jason, you have more in that area?
No, go. I know you've got another couple of questions on your mind.
Well, I just what you're talking about, Charlie, makes me start to think about the sorts of trends that we've seen, right? The public information, science, public policy sorts of issues that we've seen more broadly, right? And so one of the or at least a couple of the things that seems to have changed, right? So I think about COVID, right? And because COVID was certainly a public health aspect, it was a medical aspect, there was public information aspects. It was managed at multiple levels, right? There was a federal aspect to it, there was
Yeah.
state level aspect to it, there was certainly regional in some cases, right? I mean, in the state of Idaho where I am, local communities got to decide based on their, and whereas other states had, statewide processes. And it seems like those sorts of conversations and the wide range, the sort of politicization, the fractionalization, or if that's a if that's a fair way to put it. I mean, people had sentiments in a wide range, right? And sometimes almost dichotomously, it felt, right. How has that changed how we manage public information?
Yeah, it's put a premium even more, in my opinion, to working left of boom. So let me give you a description of what I'm talking about. In the case of COVID, for example, in addition to all those entities that are involved, so are people's personal political careers. They were involved too. I mean, look at all of the flack that Anthony Fauci took. That was really unfortunate to see that happen. But that's a reality nowadays. And so it sort of goes like this. I tell my students, nowadays, it's not enough to say, yeah, I disagree with you, but we can move on. You're still my friend. That really just doesn't happen in the political arena anymore. It is, we disagree, so therefore you are wrong and you must be corrected or destroyed. One of the two, because when you're wrong, you're evil. Now that harkens back to a moral perspective. Pardon me. But that is how I see these things changing nowadays. I mean, look at what happened to Kevin McCarthy in the United States House of Representatives. I mean, one day he's the golden boy, the next day he's chopped liver. And that happens more frequently than you can imagine within these politically controlled agencies, as well as within the budgetary aspects of higher education. So, yeah, I mean, this is a big deal. So how would I deal with that now? First of all, you've got to have a social media manager, and I even hate referring to it as social media. I refer to it as essential business communication. And you've got to have a manager who's creating content that is non-threatening and non-directive, but easily digested long before you deal with a crisis. Okay, so universities used to have professors around that were generalists. If they got interested in a flower, they'd pursue that flower. If they found a bug they liked, they'd pursue that bug. And their careers flourished. It didn't make any difference. Now, in the life sciences anyway, you're going to graduate, get a master's, get a PhD, go do a postdoc, and you better find a small peptide that tells you, the information you need to get grants. I was touring a group of legislators around one of our units there at the veterinary college 3 years ago. And this very well-knowing person said, now, how many of your professors here are on grant money? And the department chair looked at me and I said, well, all of them. You can't be a professor anymore in this world unless you can attract grant money. And she said, really? Yeah, the state budget outflow would have to be much greater if that was going to happen. So that's the first thing. So what information would they put out? If you're in business, you would put out things that are beneficial to business, that people in the business world would find and resource on a regular basis and would become to trust that as a source. Okay, if you're doing it in veterinary medicine, you start talking about dogs and cats. I still write a pet column every week in the Moscow Pullman Daily News. And I sort of have free reign to talk about any pet that I want to. And I have. And that puts a great deal of trust with me and always has. And so, but you can't have a media manager out there who is just saying, oh, today's World Hamburger Day, go bless the people that grew the wheat, that made the buns, go bless the lettuce growers. That's not enough. You have to intrigue people. Okay. We all know those special celebratory days are coercing people to look at products and stuff. Don't focus on that. Focus on things that people would say, wow, I didn't know that. Like one of them that I did was dogs have a muscular layer around their spleen, unlike other mammals. So when a dog gets hit by a car, it can get up and run away because its spleen contracts and auto transfuses that dog, at least in the short term. And it will usually go away and die somewhere else, unfortunately. But people always marvel at, wow, I hit this dog on accident and just got up and ran away. It must be fine. It may or may not be. You just have to look at that. Um, Dogs in the back of pickup trucks is illegal in the state of Washington for any reason, unless they are tethered or they are contained in a crate. Well, every construction company driving down the freeway's got a dog in the back, and it's not tethered or in a crate. And so you raise awareness of that to people, and suddenly they start to trust the source. But I don't see a lot of premium put on being proactive right now.
I appreciate that. One of the things, one of the dynamics that Jason and I have, and we've had a few other guests on that have talked about this, that school boards, school administration, right, particularly in elementary, junior high, high school sorts of, that primary education,
Right.
were placed in a situation in a context that they really, I think historically, it's true that they historically had not been. Right. I know
Right.
where we live in Boise, I mean, it was the health district, sort of trying to outline some of the, the trajectories of COVID, but then the school board had to make choices on, say, masks or social distancing.
Right.
Right. I mean, so it revealed, or it got school boards and teachers and administration involved in daily lives in ways that we think it hadn't been before. Did you see any of that, or do you see that playing out?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that members of the right-wing conservative movement have said is, pardon me, they have to start at that level and acquire the school boards, the library board, those types of things to make the changes that they want to do. They look at the example of having three Republicans placed on the Supreme Court by the previous president. And they say, wow, that's how these things are going to happen. So that's what we need to do. What they're also seeing right now is generally that's a bit of a tempest, and it only lasts for 3 or 4 or 5 meetings, maybe even a year. And then those people start not showing up anymore. And the reason is they're not getting done what they thought they could get done, number one. And number two, it's not really that interesting to sit on a library board committee and go through lists of books. I mean, that's a little boring to most people. These people were looking for a political dust up, if you will. And I encourage people to just stay the course and continue doing what you have done so well in the past. Now, it does mean that when it comes to threats to people, and I know that I also have a law enforcement background. When I was an undergraduate, I was a deputy sheriff. When it comes to actual threats to people and showing up at their houses and that sort of stuff, again, that's where being proactive would have been very beneficial. So how do you be proactive about that? You go to the sheriff's office or you go to the police chief's office when these things first start to emerge. and say, look, we need to build a bond here. And you need to determine whether or not you're going to protect us and in what ways. And in that way, people can get law enforcement's attention to these sorts of things, whereas in the past, they haven't worried about those things. So again, I go back to my proactive thing, and I would even generalize it this much more. I would say, if you look at any real communication entanglement that occurs between nations, that occurs between individuals and husbands and spouses and vice versa, if you look at any communications entanglement, there was a point in the history of your relationship at which you could have affected that more positively in future conversations. And it behooves people to really look forward like that. And one of the ways you look forward, if you're a young person going into this field, is seek out older people like myself and Todd and Jason and ask them their opinions and what they may do for something like this. Because we're all skilled at doing things like this. And social media is just another form of media to us. It is wide ranging, it is quicker than electrons can carry it. But it's still one of those things that can be managed. Stop thinking about control, because control is a construct of basically males more than anything else, who think they can get an iron grip on things, and you really can't. You can only manage things, and you manage them well by working proactively first. Put 60% of your effort at least on proactive work every day.
I appreciate that, Charlie. What it makes me think about is as much as social media, and social media certainly, or I mean, just generally speaking, has changed communications. There's no question. But the relationship aspect, which has been part of this profession and this, these processes for so long, might even be more important today, right, than it was before, right? Because you want to have that relationship, as you say, left of boom. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Hey, Jason.
something we really wanted to pick your brain about. Is there a difference between an organization responding to a crisis created by somebody else as compared to a crisis that originated internal to the organization? Is there a difference there?
Yes, absolutely. If you're talking about a crisis that somebody else created outside of the organization, that, for example, could be something like the mad cow disease that we talked about, or something like that. Again, generally, you have an element of time available. So if you were a university president and you didn't think that you were going to get called on the floor to discuss free speech in some manner, you were out of your mind. Okay. You need to realize that with all of the crazy things going on in politics, and I'm not saying that it's not happening on all sides, I'm saying it is happening on all sides. You needed to look ahead and say, what are the hot button issues that could affect my entity? Okay, now the created issues inside, that's a little bit different, because it really depends on what the issue is. So, for example, we had an employee come to us and he said, my hobby is picking locks. And I noticed that when I'm here at night alone, the locks in the isolation laboratory, which you absolutely don't go in there, he said, those are very complex and difficult to work with. I just was wanting to get permission to have a key so I could learn how to pick those locks. And of course, this is just a person with a new hobby, albeit a weird hobby, and they want to start doing things like that. And clearly you have to say no. But that person now could go on social media and talk about all types of things, including, here are some locks that I can't get into. Well, that would challenge other people to try to get into them elsewhere. So you would have to realize that internal can get that external push at any second. And so while managing those is slightly different, it doesn't mean that social media and everything else won't catch up with it on the other side. One other thing that I'd like to mention, though, too, is there are instances where the rights of the individual prevail. So I had an incident where a person came to me and said, I'm undergoing gender transformation. And I said, okay. And she told me at the time, she said, I am converting to be a male. And I said, all right with that. I got a phone call within like about a week or a month later, and it was from a print journalist who said, hey, we hear you got a trans up there, and I was wondering if I could come interview them, find out what their motivation is. Well, I said, let me talk to the appropriate people. So I just went directly across the street to the AG's office, and I had a conversation with them and realized, as I expressed to them, this person had state protected civil rights and also federally protected civil rights. So this was bigger than a university, bigger than a college of veterinary medicine. This was something that if you screwed this up could be very expensive. So basically it boiled down to, they said, call a meeting with the person and tell them that you will provide them with whatever care and concern that you can accordingly. And I did. And I spoke to the person. I said, hey, the university says we can help and work with you in any way possible. And they said, let me go talk to my team. They talked to their team the night later, and they let me know that they wanted to protect this as HIPAA protected information. And I certainly understood HIPAA at the time, that protects health information. But I did ask the journalist, then I called the journalist back and I asked him, I said, how did you find out about this? And he said, well, I got her letter. And I said, her letter? And he says, yeah. So what happens is if you're in the workplace, and this was at the time, I don't know that it's this way now, or a university or something, you have to tell the people around you that you work closely with that today I'm Jill and I use the Jill locker room, and tomorrow I'll be Jack and I'll be using the Jack locker room.
Oh,
And someone who was a fundamentalist took that letter to the media hoping to create a firestorm. And once I spoke to the reporter and explained HIPAA, he went, oh, okay, that's no big deal. I can find another story. And so, those things are going to come up like that. But mismanaged by trying to cover it up, that's going to be like trying to cover up a grenade that you fell on.
so hey, Charlie, to build off that, how do you think this internal versus external cause of the crisis, how do you think that impacts the public's expectation for the flow of information?
I think it impacts it mightily. I think the public now expects every entity to have a competent website that's up to date. I think they expect them to have a social media stream coming from them that makes everything from coupon offers, if you will, to general information like I was talking about. I think the public expects this. Consider yourself. I'm sure you've looked for something online and maybe you find it, but they don't even have a website. So you tend to discount it. And the American public is not going to say, I know these people to be important. I don't know why they don't have a website, and then look further into it. They're not going to do that. They're just going to jump to whatever comes to the top of the Google pile, And when it was medical information, we always said, people are going to talk to Dr. Google for a second opinion on all these things, and so it's very important. I had students in my classes, which I taught up until 18 months ago. I had students in my classes checking the things that I said on their phone right after I said it
Sure.
to see if it was historically accurate. And, that's an interesting concept when you think about it.
It is, in the run up, getting ready to visit with you here today, Todd and I were talking about kind of this transition over time to organizations using social media. As we were talking about, something that crossed my mind was the recent tourist submarine disaster over the Titanic wreckage.
Yeah.
So, U.S. Coast Guard was the primary responding agency to that disaster, and it called to mind the Coast Guard managing the response to Hurricane Katrina in 2005 in New Orleans. Well, there's been a lot of changes since 2005 with the
Right.
Titanic incident response They had social media. Of course, they were running press conferences, but I was able to look at their live stream through, Twitter, now X. I was
Right.
able to look at that kind of thing. Well, that wasn't the norm in '05. It
Right.
just wasn't.
Right.
It is definitely a new world out there in sharing information with the public and what the public expects.
Yeah, when you're talking about any form of exploration, I'm thinking about the Blue Origin space flights and things of that nature. I mean, there are people watching this live inside the cabin, and if there's a catastrophe, they're going to see it, and a lot of people are even recording it. And why
Yes.
are they recording?
Nope,
Oh.
we lost your audio, Charlie. We lost Charlie.
Oh,
Which is very interesting to consider. I'm sorry about that. I really
What?
apologize.
Yeah, it's fine.
People just don't realize that how
Oh, we lost your audio again, Charlie.
I have specific information so that they can sell it. And I put sell in quotes. It may be to gain social capital with friends and peers. It may be literally to sell it. I guarantee you right now, if you have a photo of or a video of Taylor Swift kissing Kelsey, you will definitely get paid for that.
Yeah.
And so people look for that now, and that's something you have to take into consideration.
Well, Charlie, I think we have taken up as much time of yours as we should. We really appreciate it. Jason, do you have anything else?
I don't. Charlie, thank you so much for joining us. It's been really informative.
It has been fantastic.
Yeah, I hope you invite me back again. There's lots of things to talk about, and they're always changing.
They
I
are.
never used a book in my classes. I said because society writes this class every day, and that's what we did.
Yeah. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. You have had such a career, and we appreciate you spending some time with us this morning and helping us and our and the people who will watch this video understand a little bit more about these dynamics. So thank you so much, and I'd love to have you back.
All right, perfect. We'll see you again sometime.
Thank you, Charlie.